about like, where did Mexico start? You know, like, when do we start thinking about Mexico? And there was one group that said, oh no, Mexico started back with the Aztecs and, with the Mayans, and that's when Mexico started. And then there was another group that was saying, no, no, Mexico started with the Spanish. You know, when the Spanish came and colonized and took all this over, that's when Mexico started. And for 100 years, literally, like the two main political factions were fighting over this. Like, why do we define as Mexico? And the result was that if you look at most of the official history and like the textbooks and everything that from which Mexican history started in Mexico, is that Mexicans are a mix. We're a mestizo nation. So that's when this young man in Tanzania asked me this question, it didn't make much sense from my point of view, because I had been raised to think about myself as a mixture between the two cultures. But if all you do is study Mexican history from the outside, and particularly in this case, what became very salient to me, as an African, as someone who had just, less than 50 years achieved independence. Tanzania only achieved independence in the 1960s. And so much of the debate that they were having at that moment was precisely like, how do we trace the birth of our African nations, whether it's Tanzania or Ghana or any of the other African nations, to an African root? What is the African root of these African nations, as opposed to what is colonial, what was brought to us from colonial times? And so from that place, from the place where this young man was in the history of his own nation, that question made a lot of sense, but it just didn't make that much sense from where I was, because that issue had been sort of resolved. So I started thinking about, how does that question get resolved? How do societies or communities come to try to figure out how to answer that question? And in the African context, what I started to study is that there's a lot of moments in history where we are faced with that question, but what is different for me? And what am I going to do? How am I going to respond? Or what usefulness can I get from something that is different from my own culture or from where I am? And that's sort of like I found the writings of this philosopher called Anthony Appiah, who writes about cosmopolitanism, and in a very short sort of definition of what he thinks about cosmopolitanism is an intelligent engagement with the other. How do we intelligently engage with others? And this has, for him, his anathesis. What he's trying to ask ourselves is, what do we owe others in relationship to what do we owe people from our own group? I mean, what do we owe from people from our own group, and how does that affect what we owe people that are not from our own group? How do we negotiate those debts between the two? So today I wanted to talk to you about how I started to use this concept to try to study the history of Africa. Because so much of the history of Africa, if you think about it, going back to literally ancient times when we had North Africa and it was part of the Mediterranean, and it's sort of like the Romans invaded, and then Egypt, having all these interactions with the other parts of the Mediterranean. There's a lot of the times when we study the history of Africa, that is the question that we keep asking ourselves. What is purely African and what has been brought from other parts? And how does that get incorporated or rejected? How does that change what we think about West Africa? So in a way, cosmopolitanism is another way of thinking that is not necessarily opposite, but that makes us think about something, instead of trying to search constantly for something that is authentic, is trying to help us complicate that notion of authenticity. Because nobody stays the same all the time. And societies, change. And they change because they want to change and because they need to change. And does that mean that all of a sudden they stop being what they were? And I think we can see that in our own lives. If you think about yourself, who you were, or who you remember you were, even if you remember who you thought you were when you were 5 or 7 years old, as opposed to who you are today, how much of that person has changed because you have been seeing other people and other people have influenced you. And is that a bad thing? Or is that just the way things are? You know, when we encounter something different from us and force us to see ourselves in a different way. I mean, that is what we would call like a cosmopolitan attitude. When you are rooted in who you are, but you're also open to understand and find solutions to your questions and your problems in what comes to you from other sources. So I wanted to share with you a couple of examples of where I saw this particular type of attitude and in some of the field and some of the questions in African history that I sort of asked. So the first example comes from the 15th century. One of the big and most sort of, if you want to think about it, the big things that have come into Africa since the 7th century, but particularly that we recognize is Islam. You know, Islam did not originate in Africa in the 7th century when Arab invaders came through North Africa. And oh my God, what's it? Sorry, it's okay. So when at that time in the 15th century, we have a number of different empires sort of emerging in what is today what we call the Western Sahel, which is in West Africa. And the empire that I'm going to talk about, it's what we used to call Songhai, it's the Empire of Songhai. And at this moment, in March of 1483, Appiah al-Hajj Muhammad, he had been a general under two preceding kings of the Empire of Songhai. He had led at this moment, he's fighting two major battles against the current king, the king that he had previously served, called Sunni-Baru. Sunni-Baru is the last of a line of legitimate Sunnis, which is the name that we give the kings of Songhai, and this what used to be basically the legitimate dynasty that ruled over Songhai. Sunni-Baru had only really been in power for like 5 months, and he had replaced his father, Sunni the Great, Sunni Ali the Great, who had died a few months ago. So basically, this is a coup d'etat. You know, Appiah Muhammad is forcibly, militarily removing, you could even say betraying, the confidence of Sunni-Baru, who was by every measure the legitimate ruler and king of Songhai. So what is the context? What is this happening? At this moment in history, Islam had arrived and spread throughout most of North Africa since the 8th century. And from there, we have found that Islam had also spread into the south, basically across the Sahara into the Western Sahel. Why do you think that is? If I would remember any sort of world history classes about how is it that Islam started to move further south into the Sahel? Yeah, so let's say that we have Morocco over here, which is like the western edge of North Africa. And so then we were going to think that we have, let's say the Sahara goes east from around here. That's the whole, the Sahara Desert, which, we tend to think the Sahara Desert separates, North Africa from the rest of what we call sub-Saharan Africa. So the Sahel goes, so we have a river that goes like this, which is the Niger. So all of this area around here is what we would call the Western Sahel. Around here, it sort of takes a little bit of the desert, it goes down into the grasslands, and almost gets all the way to sort of the coast. One of the big sort of important things that we need to think about when we think about Africa, that makes Africa very particular in terms of world history, is that it has struggled to use centralized society. By that mean, like this idea of large empires, large kingdoms. This has been a difficult process in the African context, largely because population growth has always been a challenge. You know, Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, has difficult climatic environments where it's just not, it hasn't been easy for these societies to sort of sustain a lot of population growth. So what we see a lot in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa is small pockets of communities that tend to remain small, and you know they're not highly centralized. So the emergence of these large empires from like what we would call the Middle Ages throughout African history, from the 10th century all the way to the 16th century. Songhai, Mali, Fututora, etc. All these little, not little, but larger empires is actually really exceptional in the history of Africa. And
is this when a place like Timbuktu grew up and became such a center?
Absolutely, Timbuktu is actually a big center in this story of Sunni Barrow. Of Askia Muhammad. So Songhai is going to be around here. And one of the reasons why Islam starts to become very attractive in the Western Sahel is because Muslims knew how to write. As you all know, as many of you know, probably African societies, for the most part, remain illiterate societies. By that means that their languages were not written languages.
About what era are you talking right now?
Right now,
this is the 7th century.
1453.
Oh, 1453.
Yeah, 1453.
Okay.
Yeah, this is when Askia Muhammad, when Songhai is rising to power. Songhai is rising to power a little bit after Mali is going into decline. Mali has risen at the time that Ghana was coming into decline. So these three empires were not coexisting at the same time. You know, they're kind of, one is taking over after the other goes into decline. Songhai is the last of the big ones that starts to rise towards the middle of the 15th century. And Islam is penetrated mostly among the elites of these empires, not amongst the population. The vast majority of the population are not adopting Islam. They're not converting to Islam. So the rulers of these empires, people like Sunni Barrow and Askia Muhammad, they have to balance something. They have to say, well, if I want to be considered a legitimate ruler, I somehow still have to, you know, perform the traditional rituals. I still have to behave like a traditional ruler of the Western Sahel. But there's also something that I can benefit from if I invite or even convert to Islam. So some of these rulers actually converted to Islam. Askia Muhammad is going to be one of those that is going to think about converting to Islam. And as a matter of fact, the original stories of why Askia Muhammad fights against Sunni Barrow and deposes Sunni Barrow, it's because the story went, Sunni Barrow was not a good Muslim. Sunni Barrow continued to perform what some Muslims would have called sort of pagan rituals or pagan practices, and even though, you know, he at the same time had said that he had converted to Islam, and he mistreated Muslims and he mistreated people who had converted to Islam. What happens a lot among these rulers of these empires is that they hired Muslim scholars because they knew how to write. And as you can imagine, once an empire starts to get big, and once you want to have the kinds of technologies and bureaucracies to rule a much bigger empire, writing is very useful. So that's one of the reasons why Islam had penetrated in the Western Sahel, because these empires wanted to have the ability to keep records and to write things down so that they could rule these bigger empires. But they could not convert fully into Islam, and they could definitely not force the rest of their subjects to also convert. That is not going to happen at this moment in time. So Islam remains basically at the level of some of the elites. So when asking Muhammad deposes Sunni Baru, the idea is that, oh, well, he deposed Sunni Baru because he was a bad Muslim. So then we should make the assumption that, well, Askia was a good Muslim. The fact of the matter is that if we look at the next 10 years of what Askia Muhammad does during the next 10 years, it's kind of not sure that he even knew what kind of Muslim he wanted to be.
And is it true that there's kind of like a variety of Islam also,
Absolutely.
like all across, I mean, not just there, but also southern Spain at the time that we've been looking at, and like different parts of the North African coast?
Oh, yeah.
So different versions of it in different places, right?
Yes, absolutely. And each of these versions of Islam have their own attitudes towards the other, which is what's important. So what we're going to see in the case of the Western Sahel.
I'm just going to jump up here and put in, because this is Turkey up here, so Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, that's going to come later, quite a bit later.
1453 they take over Istanbul, and so like kind of
they start
becoming a little powerful, and that's also an Islamic force, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we've had like this wave of different what we call Muslim sort of empires ruling North Africa. So we go from the Fatimids, the Umayyad, etc., etc. All of them have ruled in North Africa, and when they start penetrating down into West Africa, we also start seeing a rift. We start seeing like Muslims from the north, from North Africa, from Morocco, from north of the Sahara. They don't think that the Muslims from West Africa are quite up to the task. They're still unhappy that the Muslims from West Africa are mixing and matching, things like they're adopting the writing and they're doing certain things that have to do with Islam, but on the other hand, they're not fully committing, and more importantly, they're not making the rest of the population become Muslims. Like they're definitely not doing that, and a lot of the Muslim scholars from the north, they're just really unhappy with that. So they look down on like what these Muslims from West Africa are doing. So what we end up seeing is that the Askia starts to look at different ways in which he realizes that he has to adopt Islam in one form or shape, because a lot of the political power is, it favors the adoption of Islam, and it allows him to have these contacts with merchants that go across the Sahara, and trade is the source of income for a lot of these empires. But he cannot alienate the rest of the population of Songhai, the people that he's going to rule. So one of the first things he does, just barely 2 years after he raises to power, is he makes a pilgrimage to Mecca. But what's interesting about this pilgrimage to Mecca is who he takes with him. And he takes with him versus the city, the capital city of Songhai at this moment is called Gao. And the people that come with him are basically clerics from Gao. And these clerics from Gao, they're just still very much rooted in a tradition of Islam that does that mixes and matches, that sort of like still practices a lot of local practices and traditions, but nominally declares themselves as Muslims.
We marginally mentioned the term syncretism. Is that something that you're talking about, where pieces of the native customs that were already there, indigenous customs, are kind of like capped and sort of built onto, and then there's kind of a mix of the new coming in.
That's a lot of what's happening. But what's interesting is that it's happening only at the high levels, not among the population, the general population. So he does that. He goes all the way to Mecca. He comes back, and he realizes that that's not necessarily what's getting him the kind of legitimacy that he wants to have among, it's not getting fully established as a new ruler. Remember, he illegally took out the previous king, so he's trying to figure out a way to kind of legitimize himself. So that doesn't work. So then he starts to work with these other scholars. A scholar that comes all the way from the north, from North Africa, called Al-Magili. And Al-Magili is like a complete leader. He's from the north, he's very intolerant, he has nothing good to say about anyone who practices Islam in any other way than how he thinks. He starts to push or tries to advise the Askia to expel, sometimes to jail groups that are not, Muslims. He has advises the Askia to lead campaigns or to capture Jews, to capture anyone who does not practice Islam in the way that it's described. And in particular, he attacks one group, which is what it's called here, the Musuba. And the Musuba are basically native Africans that have converted to Islam, and they have created this small, this kind of small haven of learning, and they study Islam in Timbuktu. And this is when Timbuktu, you have Gao is the main political capital of Songhai, and then Timbuktu is starting to emerge as a really important center of Islamic learning in Songhai. And a lot of people who want to, learn and read and write, they become Muslims. They start to write a lot of important treatises, and we start to see the emergence of the big libraries in this period. And some of these men have studied with scholars from the north, with people like Al-Magili, or they have gone up north, studied up north, and then come down south, and so you found new interpretations of this one. Well, even these guys are under attack under Al-Magili. Even these guys, Al-Magili does not like. So the Askia, after a couple of years, he decides this is actually causing me more trouble because he's making, following the advice of this man is basically means rejecting everything that already exists here, like the societies that I want to rule. So he decides that that's not what's going to get him the kind of legitimacy that he wants to get. So then he finds a third advisor, and his third advisor is a man called Al-Nusmani. Al-Nusmani is a Musuba. He is a man who was born in Timbuktu, went and studied actually with Al-Magili up north, and then came back to Timbuktu. Oh, yes. So we have the Askia Muhammad.
I didn't ask about that.
And Al-Magili. And then so and Al-Nusmani finds represents a much more tolerant view of Islam that allows for this syncretism that you have, that allows for this adoption, incorporation of like local practices, even if you choose to practice Islam. And it is in this moment that basically the fact that the African ends up choosing to work and to use, basically adopt the version of Islam that Al-Nusmani is providing to him, that event allows the Askia to basically establish himself as the new legitimate ruler of Songhai. and he stays in power.
On the map, where is the Songhai?
Yeah, so Songhai is going to be like we have the Niger River. At the bend of the river, you're going to have like Songhais around here. So Gao would be a little bit north from here, and then it goes a little bit more towards the desert. And you know, the river is obviously important, and that's why a lot of these empires intersect with the river at one point or another. The desert, rainy water. So this is one of those environmental things. But I think this is one of the ways in which I think this is a really good example. I always like the history of Africa because it sort of shows to us that sort of religious change and you know the way that Islam comes to Africa is not by conquering. It's not by saying now you know you have to adopt Islam in this particular way, but Islam needs to be African in order to be adopted, in order to become something that can actually legitimize the power of someone like Aztec. You know, he has to adopt Islam, but he's to adopt a particular type of Islam. And in doing so, he's actually helping for Islam. So there's this, again, there's an intelligence in the way in which people see what is useful for me from this particular innovation. You know, in the case of Islam, one of the things that was useful was the fact that it came with the technology of writing. And then after that, there were other things that were useful, but they had to be adopted and adapted to the needs and the problems of the local world. And I think in that sense, we can use the concept of cosmopolitanism helps us understand that process a lot better than if we were just trying to create these dichotomies between what is internal and native and what is external and native. Because ultimately, as we see the evolution of history, those two things become, you know, what used to be not African, like Islam, becomes African by adopting the things that become that help us. You know, if we're smart and we realize that well, this is something that is going to help us, then why not use it and make it ours? And that's exactly what happens to Islam of the Aztec.
I don't want to derail this, but I also could speak just maybe a second too about what's happening in Europe and the response. Like what's I know you're going to get into that.
Well, I mean, what happens? I mean, in this period, if you think about it, much of the trade that fuels the growth of these empires is gold. Is the gold. And most of this gold is going through the Sahara, across the Mediterranean, all the way to Europe. One of the reasons why, for instance, why we see that why Africa is known in Europe in this period is because it's known that that's where the gold is coming. And a lot of the exploration that initiates very, very shortly before this around the Portuguese exploration is actually motivated in search for that gold.
And this was kind of mentioned before, the Portuguese exploration that you're talking about was going down this way, right? So they were actually kind of looking for entrances to get that gold, right?
Because they know that the gold's coming from here somewhere.
Right.
I mean, they don't quite know exactly where, but they know it's coming from here somewhere. So when some of the first things, I mean, the Portuguese are going to come into contact over here with what used to be the old kingdom of Benin. Then we have here what, I'm going to talk a little bit about my second example, is from what was called the Gold Coast. And that's why it was called the Gold Coast, because the idea is that somewhere in here, there's a lot of gold. We know because all that gold has been coming to Europe.
There was a story about one ruler who took a very famous trip and was just kind of decked out all the way in gold in the 1400s, and this became like a really famous. He was going on his Hajj. He was going to Mecca, but he was seen by an enormous number of people.
That was probably Askia. Yeah, you know, I mean, not that many of the, and again, for the Askia, this is a legitimation trip. You know, for him, this is like, I've just kicked out the old rulers of Songhai, and this is like my initiation trip. Like,
so
this is like coming
huge,
out.
You know, like a huge caravan with me to Mecca and show everybody all the gold that I have.
Yes, exactly, and not knowing that, that in some ways, for more traditional Muslims, that was not a particularly good look. You know, that this was a way in which you show yourself as a powerful ruler in West Africa, but not necessarily in Mecca. You know, that's not a very good look in Mecca. So again, that was another way in which the Africa had to sort of learn. You know, that what goes in your own way. I mean, like, basically he's teaching himself how to be a legitimate ruler, both at home and abroad. So it took some learning. But anyway, but I mean, this is a good segue, because what we see then, one of the results that comes out of all this trade and the growth of these empires, largely financed by the gold trade, is that this motivates more European exploration. I mean, it sounds a little. I mean, I think if we think when we think about it, it's really interesting that Africa is just across Europe, across the Mediterranean Europe, and still Europeans, when it was relatively easier for Europeans to go conquer the Americas before they actually penetrated Africa. And this has to do exactly with the environmental history. So, like, Europeans couldn't survive in very large numbers in the African continent because of malaria and all kinds of other.
We're also talking a little bit about the fact that it had Eastern connections, that Africa had some Eastern connections because it was connected better maybe than Europe was to the Silk Road and India.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about over here on the east, at this very moment when this gold trade is happening here, we have another gold trade going south across the Indian Ocean into places like Kampala, Kilwa, which are part of the east coast. And we see at this very moment the growth of what we call this fertility town. A lot of, and these towns were also, a lot of the growth of these towns were also motivated and fueled by trade. This town is not trade across the Sahara, but it's trade for the Indian Ocean. So there's, I mean, Africa is often presented, especially during the 19th century, as this isolated place, but it's not isolated. I mean, it has been receiving, influences from the outside world for a long, long, long time. So again, this attitude of or this sort of disposition to receive and adopt and learn from the outside is not something new, and it's obviously something that has been, useful to them in a number of ways. I mean, oftentimes we think, for instance, if you think about bananas, the one place in the planet where you have the largest varietal of bananas is in Africa. But bananas are not native to Africa. Bananas were brought to Africa from India. However, they adapted so well to the African continent that more and more varietals have emerged in the African continent. And I think that's an interesting sort of metaphor, of how Africa has been this real interesting experiment for ideas that have come to the outside and how things have become, once things have become Africanized, they have created this really interesting innovation. Ideas of voices, Islam is one, bananas are another. Okay, so after, what we see happening after, the Portuguese and later other European powers start to go around the continent at the same time that the Americas are being colonized is the slave trade, which of course is is a history of extraction rather than the introduction. But one of the things that we see as a result or as the outcome of this country is that there's a lot of sort of European enclaves. Europeans don't quite colonize Africa in this moment, with a very few exceptions of South Africa is the only place where we see full-blown European colonization before the 19th century. But we do see the introduction of small enclaves of European influence. And these enclaves lasted for a long time, for 200 years. So the one area that I want to talk a little bit about as my second example is the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is what today we call Ghana, at least the coastal part. In the mid-1930s, the 19th century is a really interesting moment in the history of Africa. Think about it. The slave trade officially ends at the beginning of the 19th century. So we first see the abolition of the trade, and then we see the abolition of actual slavery. And then at the end of the 19th century, at the very beginning of the 20th century, we see full-blown colonization. And so you kind of have this sense of like, okay, what happened here? How is it that on the one end we see this process in which we think, okay, well, Africans are being left alone, no more slave trade, no more slavery. But then less than 100 years later, Europeans fully colonize. How do we? Is there a relationship between the two things? And historians have debated this a lot of times. Like we said, what happened at the when slavery was abolished, that all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but years later, it caused the colonization process. But one of the things that happened is that during that period, both Africans and Europeans were trying to figure out a new relationship. What's going to happen? The slave trade it was a business. I mean, it was a source of income for both some Europeans and for some Africans. So the elimination of that created okay, we need to think about how we're going to replace that income, or how we're going to replace that source of income. But again, how are we going to relate to one another? By this point, a lot, especially in the Gold Coast, we have the Gold Coast here, we have Sierra Leone over here, who had been a settlement created for the resettlement of slaves. We have Liberia, which had, Europeans have, Americans, Liberia comes a little later, but Americans had created against for any African, full of African descent who wanted to return to Liberia. So what we start seeing at this moment is that in these places of the Gold Coast, there was a lot of new elements of what we call Western culture, Christianity. We see the establishment, a lot of missionaries start to come into this area. We see a lot of these missionaries create schools.
What's the time period now?
We're talking. Sierra Leone is created in 1790s, and then we start moving through the 1800s all the way to the 1900s. So this is before 1830.
So this is kind of post-Renaissance. This is after the so-called discovery. This is past that age of discovery. It's kind of in what we would call, and what you can see in your timelines for this class, as the Enlightenment period for Europe. And there's actually a lot of pushback against slavery during this time period. There's a backlash against slave trade.
And you see that in the abolitionist campaigns. The abolitionist campaigns are, which are not the abolitionist campaigns that succeed. Come in the early 1800s, but they're not new. They've been coming from almost 100 years before.
So there are people like Montclair and Diderot who you read who are actually arguing against continuing the slave trade.
Yes.
They don't win out.
a good question to ask ourselves in some ways, and some of the people that I'm going to talk about here sort of pick up on that. And I think that's because the people like Rousseau, for instance, one of the images that they present, like the noble savage, or the idea of like people who have not been contaminated, right, by learning or the Western world, Western ideas, and they have value, and they're important, and they have something to contribute, etc. So in some ways, those are some of the arguments that are being presented in favor of abolition. Why is it that they only become successful, however, at this moment, in the early 1800s? One is, because the attitudes are changing. But two is also just because of the Industrial Revolution. Because all of a sudden, slavery doesn't make that much sense as an economic activity. When you see with the Industrial Revolution, what you need is not necessarily cheaper labor. What you need is markets. People who can actually purchase these mass-produced things that are coming out. You need markets and you need raw materials. And in this regard, Africa, Europeans started to see the potential of Africa as both a source for markets and raw materials, not necessarily as labor anymore. So those are the two things. If you think about what replaces the slave trade, one of the things that happens in this 19th century is that they're starting to think, okay, if we're not going to trade in slaves, what are we going to trade on with? And one of the major things that started to be traded in the absence of the slave trade is ivory, from East Africa, because ivory was a major source of material produced major luxury goods back in Europe. And from West Africa, gum, timber, wax, a lot of palm oil was a big one for lubricating machines. So all of these things become very, very important commodities that are being traded in this moment. But African societies themselves have to adapt to this. They have to figure out a way to sort of shift gears from trading from one country to the other. And what we see also is an ambivalence on the part of Europeans of how they're going to conduct this trade. In the particular case that we're looking here in the Gold Coast, is that the Gold Coast has gone through many hands. The Portuguese started here. They were the first ones who created the first slave castles. That people have done. They visit, Christian Borg Castle or Alina Castle, and they were the first ones here. Then the Danes came and they settled this area, particularly in what is today the capital of Ghana, Accra. But then the British finished, and they're the ones who are present here in the 1830s. And it's not clear. It is not clear in the 1830s, all the way until the 1880s, what exactly the British want to do here. If you read their documents, sometimes they say, no, we need to colonize, and then in other documents, like, no, we don't need to colonize. Much trouble. And while this is happening, a lot of Africans themselves have become educated. And they become doctors, they become lawyers in particular. We see a lot of Africans who come from these rich families that have become wealthy, largely because they participated in some kind of trading capacity. And they start to write. And one of the things that is amazing in the country is that we see the emergence of this incredibly articulate intellectual class that is in some ways picking up precisely on all these ideas. I mean, they're reading Montclair, they're reading, and they're picking up on these values. And when I started studying them, one of the things that was really striking about them is that they were classified, if you want to think about them, as cultural nationalists. They were nationalists because supposedly they wanted independence from Britain, or they wanted to, even though they were not yet colonized, but they wanted to, like, this new relationship with Britain, but they were cultural because they wanted to assert the value of their own African cultures. But if you start reading them, you start actually figuring out what they're saying. They're a lot more complicated than you think. So I want to read you a little quote from one of them. This man is called Abraham Presley Hayford. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. And he was a lawyer. So in 1903, he published a book called Gold Coast Native Institution. And again, like I said, he was a lawyer in Europe. And he said in this, quote, in the present work, I have indicated or attempted to indicate the true nature of the problem which Great Britain has faced in her administration of the to find out what the problem is and the way to successfully deal with it. It has been necessary, on the one hand, to examine aboriginal state systems, holdings as I do, that part from the native of the soil. Any attempt of state-like administration is being. On the other hand, I have collected out of research the most important of the evidence available as to the political relations past and present of Great Britain and the Gold Coast. I consider that there can be no greater safeguard for British administration on the Gold Coast than in the free dissemination of the historical facts embodied in this book. Further, I have ventured to suggest a key to the solution of the problem is not other than the imperialization of the Gold Coast and Ashanti on purely aboriginal lands, leading ultimately to the imperialization of the which I always find interesting. Because again, if this is a man that is supposedly arguing for the independence or for the decolonization or for the non-colonization of West Africa, he should say, no, the solution is not for us to get rid of Great Britain. The solution is to adopt whatever it is that can conquer Great Britain, and like he said, along Aboriginal lines.
He actually uses the word imperialization in a positive sense.
Yeah. And again, this is 1903. This is the very early stages of British colonialism. Like the actual protectorate, the actual creation of the Gold Coast as a colony is just in the 1900s. So, we still have 50 more years of British colonialism. He's writing this, is there pushback? I mean, what's he trying to respond to? What's the other side of the argument about that? Well, that's the thing. Men like Brizuela are writing against very specific questions and issues. And they're writing as much against British intervention as they are as a way to try to shape British intervention. They themselves, like I said, they are, for the most part, Christians. They have adopted Christianity. They have been educated, Brizuela studied in Cambridge back in the day. They recognize the value of many of the things that they feel they have learned from. They want Western style education. They want Western style democracy. They want to be able to be part of the new colonial system. And they want to be able to shape it along the lines of what they think is useful from their own institutions. And that's taken as a form of national cost. Like they're feeling like that's not really good. Well, and that's what in some ways some historians have argued about. This is a form of cultural nationalism, a way of taking pride of African cultures. But if you think about it, I think that is much more a form of cosmopolitanism. Because what they're doing is just understanding what the situation is in the place where they live and saying, well, we like this type of education and we like this type of government system, but it's not going to work unless we change. It's really not going to serve our purposes unless we change. And that's what they start to do. So we have, then like I said, before, I have another historian, another writer that is another Northern German, Sarba. In German, Sarba comes from a very old, if you look at the archives, the Sarbas were traders since the 16th century. So he comes from a very, very old family of traders. He was born in 1864 and he comes from Cape Coast. Both the same, or if you think about the Gold Coast, Accra's here, in this area, to the east. And then Cape Coast is a little bit to the west. And they're both coastal areas. But they're a little bit different because that's another thing that we need to really understand when we try to understand why these writers are writing the way they're writing, is that we have at least 3 different sort of cultural groups in the Gulf Coast. To the north, and Hayford mentioned this. To the north of here, we have Ashanti, which is a big kingdom, very centralized, very successful kingdom that had become very rich as a result of this later, even though it was not a coastal kingdom. It's an Akan-speaking, they speak Cree, the language that they speak is an Akan culture kind of kingdom, and it's to the north. And when the British come into this territory, one of the main problems that they have, one of the main reasons why they end up deciding actually to conquer this area, is because the Ashanti is so powerful. And they cannot penetrate and direct trade into the inside of this territory, hinterland, the city that we call the hinterland, because Ashanti is very powerful and they won't let the British in. They have to fight 2 wars to actually conquer Ashanti. But before that, it was one of the reasons, one of the means that allows the British to conquer Ashanti is that they will offer protection to the coastal, to the gap in the what is today Accra. We was mainly populated by gas speakers and then the Fanti groups in the area. And these groups have been under the threat of being conquered by Ashanti for quite a bit of time. So this was a typical divide and conquer kind of thing. Like, the Fantis and the guys were worried that Ashanti were going to come. When the British come in, they offer protection. They said, we'll keep Ashanti okay, you guys are going to be okay. And that's how they get them to sign all these kind of treaties on protection. And, well, Hossein Hayford and Mensa Sarva from Cape Coast, which is a Fanti. So in this moment, when the British are coming in and they're establishing a new form of government, these men who are educated men, they speak English, they know how to deal with British, they also say, well, how do we make sure that the Fanti-speaking communities and societies are better positioned, in face of this new administration, in face of particularly in relationship to Ashanti, which was always. So a lot of what these men are talking about and speaking about, and when they are saying, oh, these are like the Aboriginal, customs, or like one of the things that, since Sarva is famous for, Sarva was a barrister, was a lawyer, and his life project, was actually a collection of laws and a documentation of institutions, saying these are the institutions that also that. Actually, talk about the main 2 books were the first anti-customary laws, and it was published in 1897, and the first national constitution of 1997. And this project was to demonstrate that the Fantis had laws, and that the Fantis had institutions, and that in order to create this liberation administration, they needed to understand the family laws and the family constitution so that they can be more effective.
So these guys should think of these students, Chinese students, the original laws and customs, and what you saw as not a that they dominated the regulated
Absolutely.
new government that was being on.
Absolutely. Yes. And we need to also understand that they understood very well the type of investment that the British had in this region. British colonialism, particularly in the pre-war period, is very malleable. They really have no idea what they're doing. and they're trying to do this on the cheap. They're trying not to invest too much money. A lot of British colonialism at this moment, again, is based on a promise that we're going to be able to open markets and we're going to be able to have some raw materials, but none of this is demonstrated. There's no tangible returns just yet. So they constantly have to justify having this type of administration and paying for it with taxpayer dollars. So one of the major rules of British colonialism is that colonies need to pay their own way. No taxpayer money was going to be used to support British colonies. So these men know this. These men know this, and they know that if they can figure out a way to ensure that colonialism is done more efficiently, they're going to get what they want. And they fight. A lot of the writing, they're writing against not even colonialism. A lot of the writings are for very specific things. But this one law about how land is going to be distributed different, no, that's not going to work. We need to fight that. And a lot of times, the vast majority of the time, they get away with what they ask because they know how to ask. They know both systems, and like you said, they can function as a bridge with those systems. So that's in a way, I think. That's why I think the concept of cosmopolitanism is a much better way of understanding how their attitude and their intelligence trying to figure out how to deal with it than the concept of that. Because what we see about nationalism later is this kind of idea that, no, we are we and we're rejecting what you have to offer. Well, these guys are saying, no. You can accept some things, but you need to be able to figure out how to accept it.
So this is not just cosmopolitanism being in this world kind of thing. It's not the more like, oh, we're living up to cultures or whatever. It's like what comes at a particular system, learning how it works, and learning how to change it when it does.
Well, I mean, and like what Appiah says, is understanding what you owe to your own community, and what is it that you can learn from others that can help you get that debt. Like what you owe to other communities, like either respect or just like your listening, but also how is that going to help you fulfill the responsibility that you have to do? So trying to negotiate, how engaging with others. And it's not just something that you do out of respect or out of where does that come from. But in some ways, sometimes learning from others is something that you always do. Because that can help you grow. And I think that's the attitude that these men are. Because again, they're not just negotiating with the British. They're not just trying to figure out, how do we deal with the British? They're trying to figure out how do we apply these principles of democracy, and one of their big fights is like representative democracy. Because at the beginning they don't have they kind of vote, they kind of do anything, but they're constantly trying to push for that, but in a way that they're trying to figure out how do we get this together? How is it that we can get the gas and the Fantas and the Ashantis and all these different groups to come together and live together in a way that we haven't been able to live together in the past by adopting these new ways of that we're learning. And that's like the really long-term project that we're trying to initiate.
So anyway, I once bore you with very more close from the slides, so they have but that's what I, that's the concept of cosmopolitanism that I think is useful. And I don't think that it's necessarily, I don't want to call it an African cosmopolitanism because I don't think that this particular attitude is unique. I mean, what Appiah tells you is a way in which you can engage with what is different. Understanding that sometimes fulfilling or knowing knowing our problems and knowing the things that we owe to our communities, that the solutions to those problems can actually come from someone else, and that learning about someone else can teach about ourselves. And that if we maintain that kind of attitude, it doesn't mean that we have to choose between, ourselves and our own communities and those communities that are extended to us. We can always learn something and we can always grow from our communities. Any questions? Any questions?